Good afternoon. Thanks for joining us across the fence. I'm Fran Stoddard. Today we meet with an author and endowed professor of literature who wrestles with questions of identity, race, and gender in an intimate, skillful, and profound way. Her latest book, Black is the Body, has won an LA Times Book Prize and gushing praise from best-selling authors. She's a popular teacher and a recipient of numerous fellowships, including a prestigious 2020 Carnegie Fellowship for her next project. I am delighted to welcome Professor Emily Bernard. Thanks for being here.
Thank you for having me, Fran.
So your first three books looked at interracial friendships, both famous and personal. Why was that such an important topic for you to wrestle with early on?
Well, we know that racism is a systemic problem, but I believe very passionately that it's through the interpersonal relationship that we can achieve lasting change. You know, see, people make up systems, I tell my students, and we have the power to dismantle them, you know?
Absolutely. And you know, actually, you grew up in Nashville, Tennessee, before you came north, and there you lived and went to school in the kind of white side of town, and went to church and had community on the black side of town. So you kind of had a split life. What was that split childhood like? How did it form you?
I mean, I think it really shaped me as a writer, because very early on I was living, you know, this sort of paradox, you know, of being this, living our actual lives in Nashville proper, and then in North Nashville, having a very different kind of life, and watching my parents reconcile both identities really made me understand something about the contradictions that are inherent in the way we all live.
Right.
So it formed a lot of my, I think, my creative trajectory, really.
Yeah. So then you came north to earn a bachelor's and a PhD at Yale University, and a little stopover, but soon you came to UVM, where you've stayed for 17 years now, teaching classes to primarily white students. How have your students and their inquiry changed over almost 2 decades?
Well, I think I've seen a real shift in the student body, and at this point, I would say that I had some really excellent students, and students, you know, as you know, the best of the UVM students are the best of any students anywhere. Except I find the students at UVM very gracious, you know, and not entitled that you might find at Yale, you know,
right.
My alma mater. I always tell people, they hold the door for you and they smile. And in the classroom, I find that they're really eager to not only read the books we're reading, you know, they've heard about them. Some of their parents now, you know, with the shifts, I think, in our consciousness as a culture, they come having read, or their parents having read, you know, Toni Morrison. And they're eager to engage on these issues. They understand it to be central to who they want to become. But also, they are wrestling with a new world. I had this great class once, and I had Reuben Jackson in the class. He came in to just talk about his experiences. And it was a very intimate and emotional experience for all. I don't think any of us anticipated that. And I had this young white man in the class who didn't say much. He always sat in the back. And he asked Reuben, you know, after the whole room was like an embrace. He said, you know, I see Black people on the street in Burlington, and I want to say hello, but I don't want them to feel like I'm, you know, calling attention to them, or, you know, and it was just a wonderful moment where he could ask this question, you know, which I think is not an uncommon question. And Reuben could say, it's okay to say hi, you know, it's all right. You don't make me feel,
right.
You know, inspected or something, or like a spectacle by saying hello. And those are the opportunities I love that come about in these classrooms.
Absolutely. Well, you know, certainly during the last few months of amidst tragedy and fear, it seems we've reached an awakening or a turning point of sorts in coming to terms with systemic racism in our country and the state. Are you hopeful or skeptical? How can we best take advantage of this moment?
I think we have to be hopeful. You know, James Baldwin said, we can't tell the children there is no hope. You know, I think all the great leaders, we have to. It keeps the fuel that keeps us going. You know, what is the opposite, right? Would be to just stay in place and accept the status quo. But we have to be hopeful. I think, I think it's a practice, I
Mm.
mean, I've learned at this age, so many things that we want, like anything. It's a practice. Hope is a practice. And we can make changes every day. I mean, I think there are people who are doing amazing things, and on a grand scale. But we can make changes every day. I have a really good friend who's a neighbor who's, on the phone as much as possible, calling senators and doing all of those things that they build and accumulate into real change. So even though we might feel overwhelmed, well, we're not able, thankfully, to topple Confederate statues here in Vermont, but we can, make those phone calls, and we can engage our neighbors and our family and friends in conversation, and, just make sure we are doing something every day to affect the progress that we all want to see.
Well, that might answer my next question, but certainly people of color rightfully complain that they are too frequently tasked with helping white people understand Black Lives Matter and racism and issues of race. It's exhausting. Any other suggestions for whites to take responsibility themselves to recognize and end racism?
Well, I think people, have to be able to ask questions, and I hear that, and I think that's a very, valid and important perspective that Black people are. My daughter says, Black people too often use as a Google, um, Julia said she was actually on Liz Gilbert's Instagram saying her advice to white people: don't use Black people as your personal Google.
Yeah,
But
great.
I am an educator, by nature and profession, and I don't mind the questions. I mean, I think I get saturated like anyone else. You want to live your life, you want to, go have lunch and enjoy, Shelburne Farms. But it is such an active part of my life, and I think that's true. I think that white people have to be courageous,
Mm.
and not feel not shrink back if they do encounter, you know, someone else's frustration,
Mm.
with having to. We have to be able to ask questions. I've learned about, our new shift in thinking about identity, you know, and the way we think about gender. I've learned about that by asking questions, often of my students. Let's talk about pronouns, because I didn't grow up with that language.
Mm.
As a cisgender heterosexual woman, it hasn't been part of my thinking about my identity. And
Sure.
so I had to learn, and I had to ask dumb questions sometimes. And I wasn't very lucky to encounter young people who themselves were interested in sharpening their
Mm.
arguments,
Yeah.
But I think we have to be able to ask and not take it personally if someone says, I really don't want to talk about this. Like, there'll be somebody else,
Right.
because even though that is a prevailing opinion, you also find, many Black activists who are invested in that kind of, interaction. So it's just a matter of making sure that your intentions are good and just keep moving forward in the world. And, I don't think we should let anybody else tell us that we should shut up, especially
Right.
if we're trying to learn and
Learn
trying to
something.
be right.
So.
We're trying to expand our horizons.
So your book, Black is the Body: Stories of my grandmother's time, my mother's time, and mine, is a book of 12 very personal related essays. In it, you explore many identities, as you're talking: woman, mother, daughter of the Deep South, wife of a white man, a New England professor. Its honesty, humor, and humility really has struck a chord and garnered national attention and accolades. What did you work at to give your stories the magic, and what did you demand of yourself as a writer?
Well, you're back to the whole practice thing, which I have to keep learning that lesson over and over again, that it really does. It was about honing and shaping. I feel like I can bring my best self to the page.
Mm.
I can bring my best self to the page. And I wanted to write a book that, was had something else to contribute to the conversation than what we're getting from a lot of the discourse around racial politics today, which can be really, is sort of doused in sound bites,
Mm.
and, flattens out a lot of complexity, really, of racial experience in this country. And it's sort of like yes or no, or right or wrong, and black and white.
But
And
personal,
yes.
and I'm sorry because we're almost running out of time, but personal and story is so powerful. Do you believe in the power of story to change hearts and minds? Because in a way,
I
people read
absolutely
your
do.
book and they just go, I get it now.
Yeah, it makes me so happy. And I do believe in storytelling. I mean, I grew up in the South. I'm the inheritor of generations of storytelling, particularly women, So I believe in storytelling. I think, there's a place for polemic and there's a place for policy, but it's just true that stories make us feel seen and heard and enable us to connect with other people that we don't even know. And that's been one of my great pleasures as the author of this book, hearing from readers who say, we don't know each other. We would never know each other. I had a message from a man in West Virginia who said, I'm a poor white guy grew up in the South, but your grandmother is my grandmother. And it was just such a powerful moment. I thought this is exactly what the book is for, as well as reaching young people of color who needed to be seen and heard and didn't see themselves,
Right.
in a lot of books by Black authors these days that, are about trauma and racist violence. They needed another kind of story. And I'm pleased to have been part of their journey too.
You've written a text of a book on Michelle Obama, which is fascinating. But your current project that earned the Carnegie Fellowship is narratives about Black women artists and public figures. How have the stories of successful Black women in America been told or not told? What is your thesis there?
Well, my thesis actually is in some ways less about the women and about the story of success in this culture. I always tell my students, we can tell a lot about this culture, but by who we celebrate. And stories about Bill Gates always have to do with the fact that he dropped out of high school and now is a billionaire. It just says a lot about what we value. And all the awards performances, someone gets up and says, "Thank God that I got this award." I was sort of singled out for success, and I thought about, well, what about all the people? Things didn't go the way they planned, and they had to figure out a different way of being creative or finding a home for their passions. And I wanted to tell that kind of story. And, there are a lot of Black women actors and writers and, people in the political world that we don't hear about. And even some of the popular ones like Zora Neale Hurston, there are stories about how they came to be that aren't often told, because we were focused in this culture, I think, on the success, Michelle Obama's story, we
Right.
love the story, but what about the stories where the person, maybe there was just made a mistake that cost them a lot, or encountered someone who really was an obstacle, or cultural attitudes.
We'll look for it. Emily Bernard, I'm so sorry that we are out of time. Your Black is the Body is such a wonderful book. We look forward to your next one. By the way, I didn't get to the question on motherhood. It's incredible if people want to talk about motherhood and really read some powerful things there. That would be in this book. Emily Bernard is also can be found at emilybernard.com. Thank you so much for joining me today.
Thank you so much, Fran.
And thank you for joining us across the fence. I'm Fran Stoddard. Take care.